Hello everyone, Professor Look here. So I wanted to make a video just wrapping up our discussion and our thinking about what is democracy and what are the hallmarks of democracy. So when we hear the word democracy, most of us have an intuitive sense of what it means. There's a joke in political science that we're not quite sure what democracy is, but you know it when you see it. We want to dig a little deeper into that and try to think about what democracy is. So we tend to think about voting and elections, freedom as hallmarks of democracy, of what is democracy, of what does it look like. So voting, elections, freedom, that people should have a say in how they're governed. But let's move beyond that intuition and that general sense of what democracy is. Democracy actually turns out to be more complicated and honestly more contested, a more contested concept than it first appears to be. So in this discussion, let's do really three things. Let's explain what political scientists mean when they talk about democracy. Let's think about some of the core characteristics that democracies tend to have. And let's think about why democracy is maybe not quite as simple yes democracy or no democracy that we can put in easy categories, but something that instead exists on degrees or on a spectrum, and why this all matters for how we evaluate countries today across the world. So let's start with a pretty basic definition of democracy. So at its core, democracy is a system of government in which the supreme power of government is vested, it resides with the people, in the people. The term comes from the Greek word demokratia, demos meaning people, and kratos meaning role or power. So in theory, democracy means rule by the people. But that definition immediately does raise some questions. Who counts as the people? How do they roll? Do they roll through representative or through direct democracy that they have the final say? And then that raises, how do we know whether power is really in the hands of everyday people or maybe a consolidated group of people or special interests? So political scientists generally define democracy more precisely as a political regime in which government is based on a fair and open mandate from all qualified citizens. In other words, democracy requires more than just good intentions. It requires institutions and roles that translate popular participation into governing authority. One of the most fundamental pillars of democracy is the role of law. In a democratic system, laws are supposed to be clear, stable, publicly known, and applied equally to everyone, regardless of their wealth, their status, or their political power. The role of law is what prevents democracies from collapsing into arbitrary rule or majority tyranny. Without it, elections alone are not enough for a democracy to exist. So, if we think about elections, another core characteristic of democracy is free and fair elections. This is usually the first thing people think of, and for good reason. Maybe as a child, you went and voted with your parents. Your engagement and interaction with democracy might go back to when you were a small child. So elections are the primary mechanism through which citizens grant authority to leaders. Elections are free when eligible citizens are able to vote without intimidation, without coercion, or undue barriers to participation. Elections are fair when votes carry equal weight. Ballots are counted accurately, and results are respected by both the winners and the losers of the election. Importantly, democracy requires not just the act of voting, but trust in the process itself. So there's trust in the process before the election, during the election, and after the election when votes are being counted. So before elections, citizens must be able to register, access reliable information, and if they choose to and they want to, run for office. During elections, they must be able to vote safely and without pressure on them. After elections, results must be accepted as legitimate, even by those who lose. This last part is crucial and oftentimes understated. Democracy also requires meaningful political competition. There must be real alternatives, not just symbolic opposition, which when we talk about and we learn about authoritarian regimes, we'll really see that there might be opposition, but it's symbolic. They might just rubber stamp what the authorities want. In a democracy, this political competition is important. If elections exist, but the playing field is systematically tilted in favor of those already in power, democracy begins to erode, even if the elections still occur. So another key feature of democracy is political participation beyond voting. So if we think about voting as really this entry-level way of participation in a democracy, a hallmark of a democracy is moving beyond simply just voting. Citizens can participate through parties, interest groups, civil society organizations, the media, advocacy groups, and of course, through peaceful, contentious politics protests. Democracy is not something that happens only on election day. It is an ongoing process of engagement, contentious politics, contention itself, and accountability. So, at this point, it is important to distinguish between direct and indirect democracy or representative democracy. So, direct democracy versus representative democracy. In a direct democracy, citizens vote directly on laws and policies. Ancient Athens is the classic example that our textbook uses, that every textbook uses. So, ancient Athens, classic example, though it excluded women, enslaved people, and non-citizens, in modern states with millions of citizens, direct democracy is limited, but still exists. We see elements of it in referenda, ballot initiatives, and local decision making, where people have the ability to shape public policy directly through ballot initiatives when they go to vote for their representatives. So most modern democracies are representative democracies, though, where citizens elect officials to make decisions on their behalf. This does raise issues of trust, accountability, and responsiveness. But we, in big, complex societies, we see that representative democracy helps alleviate problems of citizens not knowing or not caring enough that maybe direct democracy would, if the flaws of direct democracy would come to the forefront. So representation makes democracies possible at scale in countries of 330 million people. But it also does create distance between citizens and decision makers. So this brings us to an important point. Not all democracies function equally well. Political scientists often categorize democratic regimes into types based on how well democratic rules are practiced and protected. A consolidated democracy is one where democratic rules are deeply institutionalized and widely accepted. Elections are free and fair, losing parties accept defeat, courts and media operate independently, and democratic breakdown is highly unlikely. In consolidated democracies, democracy is not constantly questioned. It is taken for granted as the only game in town. Citizens and elites broadly agree on the rules of the system, even when they strongly disagree on the policy being discussed. By contrast, a flawed democracy is one where democratic institutions exist, but democratic quality is uneven. Elections may be competitive, but political inequality, polarization, weak governance, or declining trust undermine performance of that democracy. Democratic norms are under strain, even though the formal system remains intact. So this is where the United States is oftentimes placed, which when students read comparative politics textbook, it might come to a surprise to them that America is considered a flawed democracy. The U.S. clearly meets the minimum criteria for democracy, has regular elections, universal adult suffrage, civil liberties, constitutional rights. But democratic performance is uneven. Political inequality, extreme polarization, institutional gridlock, and declining trust mean that democracy does not work equally for all citizens. So money also plays a large role in American politics. Wealthy individuals and organized interests have disproportionate access to policymakers. Voter turnout varies sharply by income, by education, and by race. Polarization has eroded democratic norms like compromise, mutual tolerance, and acceptance of election outcomes. These problems don't eliminate democracy, but they weaken it. Democracies can also decline over time, a process often called democratic backsliding. In these cases, democratic institutions formally remain, but they are hollowed out gradually. Elections still occur, but the playing field becomes less fair. Executive power expands at the expense of courts, legislatures, and the media. Importantly, these changes often happen legally and incrementally, not through dramatic coups or the overthrow of democracy overnight. Cases like Hungary and Turkey really illustrate this pattern. Both were once considered pretty consolidated democracies. Over time, media independence eroded, courts were weakened, electoral rolls were rewritten, and opposition voices were constrained. Democracy did not disappear overnight, it faded through gradual institutional change. So, all of this highlights a critical lesson for students of politics, especially in our comparative politics context. Democracy is not just a simple checklist that a state can mark off. It is a system that depends on institutions and norms. It requires trust, restraint, and a shared commitment to roles, even when outcomes are disappointing. So finally, then, it is worth asking what democracy feels like in everyday life. In well-functioning democracies, citizens generally trust elections and courts. They believe participation matters. They expect a peaceful transfer of power. They criticize government. They can criticize government without fear of repression. When democracy weakens, these everyday experiences change, often before institutions formally collapse. So when we ask, what is a democracy? The answer is not just about elections or having a constitution. Democracy is a system of government, a set of institutions, and a political culture. It is both durable and fragile. It can persist under strain, but only if citizens and leaders continue to believe in it and practice it. So understanding democracy this way helps us move beyond slogans and, oh, you know it when you see it, and towards a serious evaluation. It allows us to ask not only whether a country is democratic, but how democratic it is, for whom and in what ways. Thank you.